All right, so thank you and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Josiah, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining this event and this session in particular. So one thing I'd like to talk about in this session is basically sharing, oh, I'm sorry, apologies, I'm supposed to share my screen. All right, just to make sure, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, sir, confirming, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you, everybody. So the topic I'll be talking about is sharing how businesses can utilize modern identity security to secure their digital transformation strategies. Okay, so without further ado, let's start and dive in to what I have to share today. So let's start by looking at what we have gotten used to since the start of cybersecurity, the perimeter. The traditional cybersecurity perimeter is pretty much physical. There is a clear distinction in what is to be trusted. Anything within the organizational premises, the workplace or the office is considered as a trusted system. And that is where cybersecurity effort is focused on in protecting that trust. Okay, anything else which is outside of that perimeter is untrusted and something that we should build walls to protect our assets from. Okay, but the modern infrastructure has upended that notion. Okay, now we have organizational assets, users, and workplaces that are located outside of that traditional perimeter. Okay, we have applications running in the cloud, users working from home, or workforces accessing on the go. Okay, these have made securing the perimeter much harder. So this brings me to the main point that I want to make is identity. And what do we mean by identity? Identity can be summed up as a way to identify a user, okay, whether this user is a business user, administrator, a customer, a third-party vendor, and how these identities are actually used to interact with organizational resources. Okay, so how do they identify themselves? These can be logging in into a laptop at the start of the day. This can be logging in into a server by administrator to perform some administrative tasks. This can be your finance individuals logging in into a finance application to check out financial records. So this is what we define as identity, used to identify these users. So traditionally, having a defined perimeter, it is easy to control how these identities are being used. But with this modern architecture, okay, as you can see, how do we do this? There's so many things in many places. How do we secure that? So if we don't secure that identity, we basically leave ourselves open to attackers, because by gaining those identities, an attacker are able to control organizational resources. And just like what this slide actually says, all an attacker needs to do is log in. Once they get the right identity, they can use this identity to actually bypass a lot of those security measures that you have spent so much time putting in place and securing that perimeter. Okay, so these attackers don't need to do some advanced attack techniques or exploit some obscure or zero-day vulnerabilities. All they need to do is just log in. Okay, so like many of you have probably heard, okay, organizations should adopt an assume breach mentality. And this is also applicable to identity. We cannot trust anyone by default. Even if a user enters the right credential, doesn't mean they are who they say they are. So identity security is the only way to provide that critical first layer of security in this new perimeterless world. Okay, we need to use identity security to control who can access what resources, at what time, and for what purpose. Controlling the type of permissions they actually require. Okay, this is the whole concept of least privilege. Having the right amount of privilege that they need to accomplish their task, nothing more and nothing less. Now let's talk about identity security and how you can secure this identity for the new perimeter. Just like adopting the assume breach mentality, the concept is to never fully trust a user's identity. And here are the steps in how we can go about doing that. So look at identity security. We can divide it, especially modern identity security, we can divide it into 4 different pillars. The first pillar or first step is to make sure that you verify every identity. Second step is to validate every device that is trying to use that identity. Third is to limit the type of access these identities have the rights to control. And lastly, to continuously monitor, analyze, and adapt to changes in that identity. So let's look at each of these steps in detail. So step one, verify every user. Here is where we need to ensure that the users are who they say they are. To do this, we must do a few things, okay, that's covered under this first step. First thing that you need to do is to use MFA everywhere. If anything requires a login, it needs to have multi-factor authentication. And we need to use this to properly validate that user's identity. And also using modern authentication methods, okay, rather than things like traditional, where people are carrying around a hardware token. Use modern authentication methods to make things easier. So when I say modern authentication methods, these are probably things that you're familiar with, those using, let's say, like a Google account or Apple account. Basically use things like push authentication, things like biometric or even passwordless authentication. These are all secure yet seamless ways for users to be able to access this. Next is to secure your applications behind a single sign-on portal. All right, so this may be counterintuitive to some people, because say, why do I need to put everything in one place? Am I putting all my eggs in one basket? But the thing is about single sign-on, because you have a centralized place, you also are able to apply security consistently for all applications in the environment. So with single sign-on, it allows you to enforce policies on all of your applications and services being utilized in your organization. It also provides a convenient way for users to access all the resources they need in a single location. Next is also to adapt with changes in how these people authenticate. How do you verify these users? So you need to have adaptive policies. Okay, apply different policies based on how users are accessing different resources based on the situation. So let's say if you have a critical application like a CRM, okay, have additional authentication to further verify that user's identity before they can actually access it. And if a user try to access an application from outside the organization network, so let's say remotely from home, maybe have them do additional layers of security, maybe things like additional verification through email. Okay. So these three steps allow you to actually go ahead and verify that user's identity. And that is the important first step. For step two, we're looking at validating every device. As part of the identity verification process, what device these people are using is also important. It is also part of the criteria to validate that person's identity. So the initial point of entry into your organization must have MFA. And this is basically the laptop, the company provided workstation. Okay, when they log into the laptop, this is essentially the endpoint that users are using for work. So everything starts and ends on the endpoint. So the access to the endpoint must be protected. So the initial login, using just a username and password to verify the user's identity, is no longer enough for protecting the endpoint. So next, we need to ensure that the endpoint is secure and complies with organizational policies. This is crucial to ensure proper security measures are in place to protect the endpoint from threats like malware, vulnerabilities, and unsecure configuration. We also need to ensure that high-risk privileged access on the endpoint is only used when necessary. So privilege rights on the endpoint should never be given fully to users, even though they have legitimate need for it. Okay? Think people like developers or IT administrators. So you have to have a way, you have to use a way to actually provide to these legitimate users of privilege only what is needed for their role, instead of giving them full rights in their environment. Okay, also we need to ensure on the device that only authorized applications can run on the endpoint. Anything that is unknown is a potential risk, or at least restrict the resources these applications can access, like preventing it from accessing local files, shared folders, or access to the internet. And this is needed to actually reduce the risk posed by these unknown applications. Right, so at step 3, we need to limit access to only to those who need it when they need it. Okay, so in this step, it's all about all full-time privileged access, like those used by administrators to administer servers and environments and systems, should be controlled. Any access that requires a privileged identity should be isolated and monitored, meaning that administrators should only access credentials relevant to their role. And when they use those credentials, all the activity that they are performing should be recorded. Okay, so activities like what kind of applications did they launch, or what commands did they execute, what configuration that they change, those activities should be audited and recorded in your environment. And also, following the concept of least privilege, privilege should also be just in time. Okay, so by default, the users, the rights, the privileged rights shouldn't exist permanently and should only be granted when they need to use this. This reduces the risk of permanent access being used for malicious ends. Okay, and especially when using privileged access remotely, ensure that that access is secure. So use secure methods of access like biometric MFA, VPN-less access to establish those remote connections. And this is especially true if those access are used by people that are outside of the organization, meaning that these are third-party vendors or managed service providers that are providing these services. And fourth, we also need to ensure proper life cycle and workflow is followed when using these very powerful credentials. Automatically provision and retire those privileged access based on dynamic changes in the personnel situation. So the fourth and last step is to ensure all identity events are analyzed and monitored. So controlling identity is just part of the solution. Okay, knowing how the identity is being used is a crucial next part. So all sessions involving privileged access should be recorded and audited and also reviewed. Okay, this is important in order to do proactive actions or even when doing forensic investigation. All sessions, especially the activity of this access should also be analyzed against past behavior to detect suspicious activities, identity threats that may otherwise appear normal that may have slipped under the radar. And of course, security is a team game. An organization has many security tools at their disposal. So having the identity security tool collaborate with those tools are important. Okay, and this is done by forwarding events as well as suspicious events and high-risk events to the organization's SOC for further analysis. So with these 4 steps, organizations can actually leverage on identity security to provide that initial level of protection, protect that perimeterless environment of your identity. Okay, with those 4 steps, identity in organizations can be protected. And what vendor, you may wonder, that may help you achieve those 4 steps? So wonder no further. So CyberArk is the only identity security that is able to help your organization achieve all that I have talked about. Okay, so CyberArk has a comprehensive identity security platform that is able to help you achieve end-to-end protection of all the different types of identities within your environment. Whether is it those used by your employees, by your workforce, to those used by your privileged users, like your administrators, to those used by your external administrators, like third-party vendors and managed service providers, all the way to even those used by non-human users of identity. So CyberArk has these three different pillars. We have the access pillar, like I mentioned, that is catered to provide strong authentication to when a person tries to access its the initial point of access to your environment. So if access, CyberArk has MFA and SSO solutions to provide that type of protection with the CyberArk Workforce Identity solution. Also under this pillar, access pillar, is we also provide the similar protection that we can use to protect your employees, your workforce, and use that to also protect the identities of your customers that are using services that you're providing. So this can be an internet banking app. This can be a web portal where the user can log in and manage their information and orders or services. This is covered by the CyberArk Access. The next pillar that we have is the privilege pillar. And this is really focused around protecting the privileged identity. So as I talked about earlier, privileged identity is a very high risk, very powerful identity. And they must have additional layers of protection. And under this privilege pillar, we have the CyberArk Privilege Access Manager, or PAM, that is available to be, and this is the component that is able to protect and control how privileged identities are being used in the environment. We also have our vendor PAM, which provides and protects a secure, remote, VPN-less way of accessing privilege in the environment by people outside the organization. And we also extend privilege protection to the endpoint, protecting the privileged rights that exist on the endpoint and only granting people the appropriate rights that they need to perform their task. And this is not all. We also extend privilege coverage to the cloud. So with CyberArk's Cloud Entitlement Manager, we are able to provide visibilities into the identities that are used to administer your cloud infrastructure, those inside AWS, Azure, GCP, and more. So with this visibility, we are actually able to provide a very comprehensive privilege protection of those privileged identities. So the first two pillars that I talked about is really looking at the human users of identity. But humans are not the only users of identity. You also have those non-human users of identity, those service accounts, those application accounts. These are still identities and they are in use, and you also need to control and protect them. And this is where the third pillar of CyberArk is identity security is able to help with the DevSecOps pillar. And when we have secrets management solutions to be able to protect these non-human users of identity, all the way from your traditional monolithic applications, like traditional application servers running as VM, to modern environments using agile environments like DevSecOps, using automation. We have those secrets management solutions to cater to those environments. And with this coverage, CyberArk provides the most comprehensive identity security coverage in the market. No other identity security vendor provides the coverage that CyberArk does under one umbrella. Okay. So you'll probably be wondering, all right, so this means that with identity being located in many different locations, in many different applications and systems, how integration becomes important. And yes, that is exactly true. And CyberArk has identified this because security is a team game. So CyberArk has created a C-Cube Alliance, and we are the first identity security vendor to ever created such an alliance. Okay, this alliance has been ongoing for more than 6 years. This C-Cube Alliance is a partnership with other technology vendors to have supported out-of-the-box integrations. So CyberArk is able to manage identities wherever they may be, in your server, in your cloud, in your applications, in a SaaS application. Okay, in DevSecOps tools, all of these are available and all these integrations are available out of the box. But how about those systems that are not part of this list? So not to worry, because CyberArk has also a customizable platform that can be used to create those custom connectors and plugins to allow CyberArk to manage the identities in those systems. So that way, we ensure that we manage the identities in the organization wherever they may be. So embarking on an identity security project can also be a bit daunting for organizations, okay, especially if they're starting from scratch. So CyberArk understands that, and that is where CyberArk actually created what we call the CyberArk Blueprint. The CyberArk Blueprint is a best practice framework that we've created, which is based on CyberArk's experience, both in deploying identity security in the wide range of different organizations, from big to small, from financial to government, to manufacturing and so on, as well as experience from providing services as well, helping organizations that have encountered security breaches. So we also learn those experience. And also because of CyberArk's identity security leadership as well. All of this experience we have used and created this blueprint to help customers, advise customers on how they should go, okay, or at least some guidance on how they should go into embarking on a journey in protecting the identities within the organization, right? So with that, actually brings me to the end of the session, okay? I'd like to thank everyone for your time in actually attending this session where I'm sharing you about identity security and how it can help enable your business to drive and move forward. Okay?